We are now live.
Welcome to the 2-month review, the weekly podcast brought to you by Open Learner 3%, in which we take a book, talk about it week by week, break it down, have jokes, just discuss whatever we want to discuss. This season, we are doing Virginie Despentes' Vernon Subutex, the whole trilogy, and today we'll be talking about Volume 1 with special guest Frank Wynne, translator extraordinaire from Spanish, from French, who has translated 64 books?
Oh, probably 70 something at this stage. I don't know. I don't count them.
I was trying to count them up on your website, and there's
a whole bunch I haven't added recently. The easiest way for me to check is that my mother, who has not read a book since she was about 20, has a complete collection of my books, which she lends out to her. She has a lending library, which is just my translations of books, you know, going all the way back to 1998. She has not read a single one of them. Nobody, not a single person in my family has read any book that I have had, whether I've written it, edited it, or translated it. Not a single member of my family has had anything to do with them.
I feel like that's a badge of honor.
It kind of is, really. It's you know, I mean, I grew up in a house where we had my father was born in 1901, so you know, so I'm a child of his second marriage. He dropped out of school at 14. He set up a printing press in the backyard of a kind of a tenement. I mean, in as much as Sligo can have a tenement. I mean, there were 8 children in the family in a 3-bedroom house. So he set up a printing press in the yard. He did very well for himself. That was all fine. His first wife, I assume, could not have children because they didn't. She died in 1951. He married my mother in 1959 and then had 4 children. The only books in our house growing up were an entire collection of P.G. Wodehouse in hardback.
Oh.
The 4 volumes of Churchill's History of the Second World War. And the 1939 illustrated edition of Ralph Mannheim's translation of Mein Kampf.
Whoa. Not what I expected.
Yeah, not what I expected, but my guess is, you know, Collins did an edition in 1939, you know, when, you know, my dad was pushing 40 at that stage, when Hitler was coming to power, and they did a new edition of Mannheim's translation. And so it was like, these were the books we had. Nobody read any books in my house at all. and yet, in 1959, so several years before I was born, my father, with Tom Henn, who then held the chair of English at one of the Cambridge universities, set up the Yeats Summer School in Sligo, and ran and was president of the Yeats Summer School until he died. So I grew up in my teenage years. So I would work at the summer school during the summer because, you know, it was money and whatever. And so I would go drinking with people who I didn't think could be of any great literary importance because they were friends of my father, and my father didn't read books. Right. But they were, you know, Kathleen Raine, Richard Ellman, Seamus Heaney, Paul Muldoon, Paul Murphy, Brendan Kennelly, you know, all these people were just like wafted in for a couple of weeks, you know, and I'd be down a pub, you know, having a pint, you know, showing them poetry that I'd written. It's a terrible thing to admit. Thankfully, it's all been destroyed since. And so I thought, you know, I mean, it was just, it was such a bizarre thing to be doing. I would sit there and record the lectures. So in 74, maybe, Richard Ellman gave a lecture. I mean, what people were expected to do was simply give the title of their lecture. And the title of his lecture was A Late Victorian Love Affair. And so everyone sort of vaguely assumed it was Yeats and Maud Gonne and yada, yada, yada. But actually, Ellman was working on his Wilde biography at the time. So it was actually a forensic blow by, well, let's say blow, of Oscar's relationship with Bosie. And the amount of pearl clutching in the audience was significant. This is 1973, in Holy Catholic Ireland. So yeah, no, it was an odd way to grow up. I mean, books, and certainly books in translation. I mean, if we don't include Mein Kampf, which I have to say I haven't read either in German or in translation.
This is something that like comes up every so often in one of the classes I teach about world literature. But the place that I have read Mein Kampf is in Knausgaard, where he talks about in the book 6 reading Mein Kampf, but then quotes from it extensively. So, like everything that I've read Mein Kampf within a translation in which someone is like interpreting Mein Kampf for a larger work.
And one of the most cowardly decisions in publishing ever was to call it My Struggle rather than Mein Kampf in English. He has deliberately taken Hitler's title. And therefore what you do, I mean, for example, the last section of a novel recently published that I translated, Alice Zeniter's The Art of Losing, is called Paris est une fête. But Paris est une fête is the French title of Hemingway's A Movable Feast. So I call that section A Movable Feast because that's clearly what it's alluding to. The notion, and it was cowardice. I mean, basically, Harville decided that they could not get away with calling this Mein Kampf.
It would be a very weird search inquiry.
Well, it would, but actually, there is, in the level of ego and arrogance of Knausgaard, there is a parallel there. And I don't, I'm not equating one with the other, but there, he's deliberately making a parallel, and he understands what he's doing. For us not to understand that until, say, volume 4 is actually a mistake, because from its beginning, he is saying, I am arrogating all of this to myself, and everyone else can go hang, including, my wife, my children, my father, and on the other hand, I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I have read nothing better about grief than the last 160 pages of volume 1. Nothing, ever. It is that forensic taking apart of a home after someone has died is just devastating.
Yes.
So he's extraordinary, but no, it's one of those things where people say, what do you do with titles? Well, in this particular case, you very much needed the title to be what the title alludes to, rather than, well, we're just going to translate it literally as My Struggle because that's what it means. Yeah, well, so does Mein Kampf, but that's not how we know it.
That's not, the signifier is way stronger there. Like it's fascinating to think about. I hadn't really considered that. I knew that was the title and I knew that aspect to it, but I hadn't thought about it in the way that you're describing it. But it really is a key to understanding that whole 6-book project.
Of course. And he's not reticent about it. He's prepared to put that out there. So it was, I mean, I don't know, but my guess is it was not a translator decision. It was an editorial decision. Editors say, this title isn't really going to work in English, and people are going to think it's about Hitler. Well, I mean, in a way,
I can imagine this marketing meeting where it's like someone's like in there, nice, prim and proper in a marketing meeting. They're like, okay, what books do you have coming up? And like, Mein Kampf. Bear with me. Just give me a second. No, not that one. No, really. It's also not, it's not about that at all. Like, no. Oh, okay.
And he hasn't been to prison, and he didn't write it in prison. And, as far as we know, he doesn't have any plans to take over any major government. As far as
the final solution do not appear in the book one single time.
No. It's but it's if we shift very quickly to Vernon,
this is a major source of things I want to talk about. I have so many things to ask you.
So, I mean, we talked about changing the title of Vernon because, Subutex is basically a French version of methadone. It is a drug that you use when you're coming off heroin. And the Vernon comes from the Boris Vian character. Well, okay, we can't do anything about that. It's too late to go back in time and force people to read Boris Vian. But, do we change Subutex into something that people will recognize that this cannot be his name, that it is quite clearly the name of a drug? And in the end, what would be gained? Not enough. Vernon Methadone is just not a very good title, apart from
it just doesn't work.
It doesn't sound like a person. It doesn't sound like a creation. I mean, the odd thing in Vernon is that actually we spend the entirety of 3 volumes, spoiler alert, without actually ever knowing what Vernon's name is, either his first name or his last name. We just don't know.
I had that as one of my notes on my paper to hint around, because I thought that was the case, but I couldn't remember for sure if maybe I missed it because I read him over so many various years.
No, we have no idea what his name ever was. And of course, despite the fact that we have flashbacks to, when the record store was set up and so on and so forth. I mean, there are lots of people who knew him before he was called this.
Right.
The appellation is clearly much later, but none of them ever refer to him as anything other than, and of course his first name may have been Vernon. It's not, it's not. But also, why Subutex? Vernon it's a very odd form of everyman, but he is an everyman character. But he doesn't have a backstory in Smack. He doesn't have, actually he took relatively trivial drugs. He went to all the right concerts, but took, almost none of the drugs, So we have no reason to believe that he would ever have needed to come off heroin. We don't have any belief that he was ever on heroin, as we know, one of the great things in Volume 1 is the Litany of Deaths, the first Litany of Deaths, when he has 3 friends who die in the space of 18 months.
Mm-hmm.
These are the people who lived the life, did the drugs, did the whole thing. Vernon was, I was interested, and I talked to Virginie about this when I was translating the first album, as to whether she'd ever either read Nick Hornby's novel, High Fidelity, or whether she'd ever seen the movie. She had seen the movie, but she had never read the book. In fact, she didn't know the book existed. It's a perfectly entertaining book about music, but Vernon is the John Cusack character. Vernon is this kind of everyman who introduces you to stuff, that you wouldn't otherwise be introduced to. You wander into his. There's a wonderful line very, very early on, delivered by Jack Black in High Fidelity, when some guy comes in and says, "I want to get a record for my daughter. I need a copy of I Just Called to Say I Love You." And he says, "Get out of my shop." And it's like, it is life as a form of curatorship, where actually, what's extraordinary about Virginie and about Vernon is that actually the curating is very polymorphously perverse. There is none of this kind of elitist, I was a punk, therefore everything has to be punk, or I was, into whatever, new romance, or straight edge, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It is, if we look at all time, these are the things that matter. So that extraordinary piece where he's DJing a set at Kiko's apartment, and is following Prince with Rudimentary Penny, followed by Candy Staton, followed by, and it's like, what the fuck, who does this kind of thing? And of course, the answer is, apart from in this particular fiction, nobody really does this thing.
It's so fun.
It is. It is. It is. So I mean, I have said before that I would literally have cut off my left arm to do this, and I didn't quite. But basically, I was at a dinner with Christopher McElhose, and he took me aside and said, "You know, you're supposed to be translating this novel for us. It's a rather wonderful kind of historical novel." By Antonin Varenne. He said, "I don't want you to do it." And I said, "Okay." He said, "I want you to do this instead." And I said, "Can I do both?" He said, "No." He said, "You can either do this or you can do this." I said, "Okay, well, okay. In that case, I'm afraid there just isn't any choice." So, I mean, the thing is, we're about the same age. She's a couple of years younger than I am, but not much. We both grew up queer at some level in atmospheres that were not exactly predisposed to queer. We both, left and drifted and had a bunch of very different lives. I mean, I didn't become a translator until I was 40. I had, 6 or 8 careers before that. And, I never turned tricks, but if I thought I was cute enough, I might have. It's not as though I was against the idea. I just didn't think anyone would pay for it. And there's something. I mean, I was familiar with her work from before, but what was extraordinary is that this is about what it means to be middle-aged when you're me. When you're my age, when you're, and one of the things that you learn as you grow into middle age is the way in which people that you knew when you were younger diverge. So, I have friends that, I went on marches with in the 70s or 80s, for whether they were pride marches or for labor or for, whatever, who drifted towards the right and basically eventually thought, look, I'm happy living in the I've got kids, I need to be able to send them to private school. I mean, what are you talking about? These are my kids, and it's like, well, yeah, but you are betraying everything that you always said that you believed in, Yep. But then you also have the throwbacks. You have the people who are like, well, it's not 1977 anymore. It's not, people aren't going out and smashing things and destroying things. Yeah, that didn't really work. I mean, nice idea, great historical moment, but, on the scale of things, how you make progress is an incremental thing. And so you have, Vernon as this kind of bizarre lightning rod who still has, this sort of disparate bunch of friends who've grown into being a variety of different things. And it was working with Christopher was very interesting because Christopher is very much an editor of the old school. I mean, you turn in a translation and he makes notes in the margins and then, his assistant scans it and sends you a PDF. There's no track.
My own heart. I don't understand how any of that shit works.
There's no track changes going on here. But so I wrote to Christopher, and I'd done a couple of bits for Christopher before this. And I said, okay, look, I know what the McElhose style sheet is, no contractions outside of dialogue, no slang outside of dialogue. I said, look, we're burning all of this. This sets itself up as though it's a piece of third-person narration, but it's not. It is that very useful thing, which we call third-person limited, which means that in each chapter, you're privy to the thoughts of the person who is the central person in this chapter, even though they're narrated in the third person. Therefore, I need to be able to switch my narrative voice chapter by chapter, and some of them will be, slangy and obscene, and some of them will be middle class and nice. And You just have to go with me on this. And one of the great things about Christopher is that actually, despite his rather fearsome reputation as an editor, I mean, we could probably both name at least 2 translators who've never put their names to anything that was published by Christopher.
Yes. Yep.
But actually, if you sit with him and you say, this is why I need to do it this way, this is what the book is trying to do, this is why I need to do it this way, Christopher's absolutely fine about it. He's not sort of beating the drum of, you must do things my way. It is very much, okay, I completely understand what you're saying. Fine, we'll do it.
And this has come up in a different form over the past few days in different contexts for me. But there's a sort of the idea that brings up to me is the idea of being an editor who's like, most of the time this works. Most of the time these rules apply. And if you're, as a translator or within a particular work, being like, this time this doesn't work, your approach is not efficient right now, they do something else, you're like, oh yeah, perfect, that's fine. Most of the time, my efficient way is being efficient.
No, most of the time, people are, most people write novels in a relatively straight version of whatever language they happen to be writing it in. And so
follows these very simple rules. People like that. But then there's
that's all fine. But then there are novels where actually you say, no, I'm sorry, you can't break this sentence. No, yes, I realize that, it's a 3.5-page sentence, but, there's a difference between a Proustian 3.5-page sentence, which is literally a matryoshka doll of clauses that encompass a single idea, and the, let's say, lazy, for the sake of argument, French/Spanish, very long sentences because I haven't been bothered. I mean, as I was told many, many years ago, the reason that French sentences are very long is that you have to use the shift key to get a full stop on a French keyboard. Whereas the comma is right there.
I love it. Jokes about like those kind of like ethnic jokes about laziness are maybe the ones that I'm like, well, these aren't offensive. I like everyone being stereotyped as being lazy is my favorite.
Well, the thing is, I mean, both French and Spanish tolerate quite long sentences that we would not consider in English. I mean, if we're parsing this to be sentences, they do not, this is actually a whole bunch of ideas strung together with commas. It's not a single idea.
Right.
And so people say, well, can we pause here? Well, actually, let's talk about, and, Pache, Roland Barthes, and everyone else, but let's talk about authorial intent, because actually, despite everybody, authors do still actually have, an intention as to what they're attempting to do. So are they trying to create some, so I translated, I was lucky enough to translate a piece by Javier Cercas a couple of years ago because Anne McLean was usefully too busy. Javier loves repetition.
Yeah.
It is part of how he works. And so part of my cover notes to the editor is, look, I have needed to find phrases that I can use 12, 15, 20 times in this that will work in each iteration and be a verbatim transcript, because that is actually what Javier does. This is a decision that he is making. And there's a difference between this is a decision that he is making and, yes, of course, that sentence could have ended like 3 weeks ago. But nobody bothered. So it's one of those things when people say, how do you approach translation? I approach it on a book-by-book, line-by-line basis. I don't know that there is another way to do it, because there isn't a rule where you can say, I'm going to do this. If I had, a dime for every time somebody from a translation program came up to me and said, do you favor, domestication or foreignization? And I said, have you read any translations that Lawrence has actually done?
Yeah.
How much foreignizing is there in Lawrence's actual translations from the Italian? Not very much, because they needed to be published. But actually, I've done quite a lot of foreignizing, and I find the entire backstory of that and the theory behind it hugely useful in making the decisions that I'm making. So, I mean, I've very frequently calqued, I mean, not any words, but phrases or idioms or whatever from other languages because I like them. There is in a novel I translated years ago called 7 Ways to Kill a Cat. At some point, two people are referred to as entre culo y calzón. And the standard idiom in English would be to be as thick as thieves, which A, is old. I mean, it's 19th century, it's tired, it's, you know, whatever. It's not doing anything. And I translated it as these two are as tight as arse crack and underpants, which is a very visceral image. You know, I mean, everyone knows what you mean if you say that. It's not a phrase in English, but it is now.
Yeah, exactly. That's super fun. The inventiveness that's allotted to you as a translator is fantastic when you take advantage of it.
When you take advantage, when you know what you're allowed to do. I mean, one of the odd things when you start is that I remember talking to a young translator, this is more than 10 years ago now, you know, who just wrote to me and said, you know, I'm just starting out, you know, do you want to meet up and have coffee? I just like, you know, some information and whatever. And so we're having coffee and he said, who checks? And I said, what? He said, well, I mean, who checks that, you know, you've translated all of the book and, you know, all the right words in all the right order? And I said, nobody checks.
Nobody checks.
Nobody checks. Which is why you need to police yourself, you know, at least as well, if not better, than anybody else is going to police you, you know. By the time you deliver to an editor, you have had to make most of the crucial decisions that you wanted to make. There might be, you know, there will be gray areas, and, you know, believe me, I have, if there's anything that I'm grateful for in the world, it is editors and copy editors who are, I mean, and good editors and good copy editors have not only saved me from myself, but have made things that I have worked on better than they were because they understand what I'm trying to do. And in the way that I've tried to explain editing to other people is an editor is somebody who really likes your book and wants it to be as good as it can be. So they're only raising flags when they're not quite sure what you're doing, and they're thinking, well, if I don't know and I love the book, then, you know, what's a reader going to do? And again, one of the things that you have to tell emerging translators is it doesn't matter what your editor sent you. This is all, quote unquote, in the spirit of suggestion. Yeah. If you want to stick with this, then you say, I'm sorry, step. I want to keep this, you know.
So this is coming up. Okay, so this is maybe a bit of a segue, but I think it's pretty close. We need to talk about MILFs and yummy mummies at some point here. I don't know if you've listened to the podcast, but this has become a trope. Yeah. But we are publishing the book The Child by Kjersti Skuldensvald that was translated by Martin Aiken for Granta. And the edition came out today. And our edition is coming out in October. And we're going through and changing a lot of the Britishisms to English, or to American English. Yeah. But a lot of them are questions for Martin and questions for Kjersti, because it's like half voice, half, like when you tell when it's like the voice, and when you tell when it's like British. Like that, and like where that line lies, that gray area is very fun as an editor and as a translator. So I'm sure you're aware of this, but the yummy mummy MILF controversy rages supreme. Did you what? You translated to the British. So as I understand it, you translated. Let me put this into to everything. The original French version doesn't have either yummy mummy or MILF.
No.
In the British version, you used yummy mummy. Yeah. In the American version, it was translated. They were like, no, MILF.
Yeah, indeed. Now, the thing is that these are two separate people. Um,
Love it.
there's no such thing as yummy mummy, I'd like to fuck.
Yeah.
Um, a MILF is not a yummy mummy, as far as I'm concerned. A MILF.
Okay, let's break this down. How?
Okay, so a yummy mummy is a mummy is a mother, usually of quite young children, who's really happy and fulfilled in her role, who hangs out with other mothers and is,
Does a lot of yoga.
Does a lot of yoga. She probably does Pilates every second Thursday. She knits her own yogurt.
It's a lot of work.
It is. It really is. Whereas MILF is, it's a great piece of coinage and it's a very, very useful phrase. But MILF is somebody who is sexually attractive to younger men, possibly younger women, who knows. And of course, the definitive MILF is from American Pie, so she is not a mother really in any sense. I mean, she has no interest in mothering her children. So she's not at all a yummy mummy. I mean, this is a woman who famously says, I never sleep with anyone who's younger than the scotch I'm drinking. Yummy mummies don't say things like that.
Okay. Oh, wow. I like this. This is even more detailed than the insane breakdowns that we've had on other episodes.
I've got no problem with MILF, but it's not
either.
The intent isn't quite the same. I mean, one of the things I wanted to say, I was thinking about this earlier today, is that, and aside from the fact that it would cost me money, I think that books should be translated separately into multiple Englishes. The only language in which this actually happens, and it happens because of a single person at a single time, is Portuguese. So when Luis Schwartz started Companhia das Letras, he began by having a number of books translated into Brazilian Portuguese, which is functionally quite different from Portuguese.
Right.
And these days, if you're selling rights in a book, you sell Portugal and you sell Brazilian Portuguese separately. I mean, this is a man who started a company 25 years ago, and his first #1 bestseller was a new translation of To the Finland Station. That takes fucking chutzpah. But we don't do that. Now, there are languages in which I think it's worse. So translations into Spanish are most of the Hispanic world hates the fact that they're translated into Castilian Spanish, because actually, terms of population, Argentina, Peru, Mexico, please. I mean, why are they not being translated into Mexican Spanish or Argentinian Spanish or whatever? But they're not. And that is strange and problematic because, and this is particularly true with slang, because slang evolves at a different pace in different languages at different times. If you read, one of the things that eventually I will browbeat somebody into allowing me to retranslate is Celine's Journey to the End of the Night.
Oh, shit, seriously? I will do that in a heartbeat.
Good. Because the problem is that French slang over the past 100 years really hasn't changed all that much. If you are reading Voyez-vous la nuit in French, it is like being kicked in the stomach repeatedly. If you're reading Mannheim's translation, which, let's face it, isn't even the first, it's the second translation, it all sounds very posh and rather Victorian and very kind of... And the problem is that British slang, or indeed American slang, has moved on hugely.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of French slang has not. One of the people being critical about my translation of Virginie said, and she uses such incredibly precise slang, which is, I don't think that Frank Wynne gets. And it's like, and then she cites a couple of words. So the first word she cites is flingue, meaning gun. Now that dates back to 1870 in French. It would have been called a heater if you were translating a novel from the 1930s. And it would be called a gat if you were translating a novel set in the Paris suburbs at this point. I need to plug this Mac in, otherwise it's going to die. Give me 1 second.
And in that second, the co-host, Brian Wood, who has arrived from the hospital. He was suffering from severe COVID reactions and then flatlined, but then came back just to co-host this episode of the 2 Month Review. Hey, Brian, how are you doing?
Doing very well, very well. Sorry I was late. I didn't want to miss this for the world. So,
holy shit, this is a great episode. You people who are watching, the one person who's watching this live, like I will cut this part out from the podcast part, but like, holy shit. Frank's amazing and telling the best.
Okay.
It's the best stories.
So have you gotten into the book yet, or just still kind of talking about the world of translating?
We talked about Yummy Mummy and MILF.
Is he Camp MILF?
Nope. It has so very, very good description of the difference between MILFs and Yummy Mummies, which is the description that Katie Whittemore gave outside of the podcast before of Yummy Mummies are a lot of work.
Nobody wants to fuck yummy mummies. They are not mothers. Yummy mummies, wear cashmere and they worry. They go to jazzercise.
Win.
MILF is an objectification of women. MILF is I am looking from the outside, and it's like, yeah, okay, you're old and you've probably had kids, but I'd still do you.
Yeah.
So it's not the same thing at all, but unfortunately, nobody in America would understand the concept of a yummy mummy, and they
do not. They do not at all. But my question for you, because this came from my class earlier, because we were talking about my class ended up for this world literature and translation class ended up becoming a lot about in the last third of the semester about transgressive writing. Yeah. To one degree or another. And this book played right into that, where it's like the words on the page, there was an objection to the Johan Orpy book that we published by Max Bessera that's about a real life character, but very invented and very funny and very satirical, in which there's the word massa. And there's colonialism, and there are people who are dominated, and the Spanish Empire. Yeah, and it's racist in that way. And so there was questions about that word alone. And as that came up, I kept thinking, you use in Vernon Subutex all the words.
I know, all the words. One of the great things is she gives you, what Kurt Vonnegut used to say is all the 50-cent words. It's but in this case, all the 2-cent words. No, it's again, you cannot remake the past by stopping reading things or stopping writing things. The most terrifying thing that has gone on in the United States in the last, 30 years is the fact that every year, Huckleberry Finn is second these days to Harry Potter with, we want to censor this book for, the language that it uses. This is not only the great American novel. I mean, Moby Dick is actually a European novel, really. But also it is the most humane, most compassionate novel that could have been written by anybody at that time, and it was. You can't undo that. As George Steiner used to say, any book that you're reading that's more than 5 years old, you're already doing a historical interpretation of it. You have no choice. There are lots of things that, there are lots of things that, for example, in French that I don't translate in equivalent sense. So French, for example, still routinely uses the word fille to refer to a woman in her 20s or 30s. We no longer do that in English. So unless I think that the author is attempting to make a point by doing it, I don't translate it as girl, because we don't. If I think the author is attempting to make a point, then of course I translate it as girl, because the author is making a point. And you need to understand what the author's point is. You can hate the author's point, you can disagree with the author's point, but what you there's no language always finds a way to subvert the ability to try and police it. So, for example, I have no idea whether in the United States you've ever used the word spastic.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So the word spastic was invented by the Spastic Society in the 1970s as a way to get away from using words like crippled and so on and so forth, which they thought were derogatory. Immediately, the word spastic became derogatory because children in playgrounds used it.
My generation.
20 years, 10 years, 15 years later from there, people with special needs were called special needs. And that became a hate term in playgrounds. If you don't change people's opinions, then changing the language isn't going to make a fuck with a difference. I mean, you cannot police the language. You actually, if you change people's opinions, then they will stop using these terms of abuse. I mean, when I was young, I'd never even heard the fucking word gay, because, we were called benders or queers or steamers or whatever. And gay was the, bright, shiny, positive thing. But of course, once the term became commonplace, then it became a term of abuse, because if you think that it's an abusive thing, then you use it as a term of abuse. So yeah, I mean, what I love about what Virginie does is Virginie's approach to language is a bit like alphabet soup. It's like occasionally as you stir the alphabet soup, rude words just appear.
It's one of the things I most love about her writing is that there is the close third person, as we were talking about, with each one of the characters, where it's not quite in their mind, but it's close enough. And you've got this like hovering, omniscient narrator that's not a narrator. And yet, if you were to find that narrator as Virginie Despentes, she is on the outside. She is at the edges, being like, I don't agree with you. That's where like the Kathy Ackerness of this is the most
absolutely.
Where it's like someone who doesn't fit into the camp, of being like a traditional accepted feminist voice, and doesn't fit in the camp of the other.
No, I mean, Kathy is one of her formative writers, understandably. I mean, basically, if there's anything to be on the outside of it, Virginie has been on the outside of all of it, always. And, I mean, it's not even the Groucho Marx, I wouldn't want to be, accept me as a member. It's like, even if you set up a club around me, I wouldn't join that either. I'd be outside protesting about you setting up a club. She's
a club. Setting up a club.
Yeah. She's just she's angry about the world, and she doesn't really. I mean, what's interesting, at this point I've now translated both Virginie and Paul Preciado, who is her close friend and was her partner for many years. Paul is very rigorous and very disciplined and uses language in a very kind of scalpel-like way. One of the great things about retranslating King Kong Theory was restoring the chaos that is her voice. She's not terribly disciplined in what she's saying. It's like, and another thing, and another thing, and another fucking thing, are you still listening? She's, and yet, you meet her and you couldn't meet her ego would fit in a matchbox.
No way. That's amazing.
Seriously. No, it really is. But while we were on the slang thing, so there's the whole Americanization is like, well, no one's going to understand the word wank. I saved up the word shit
I'm
wank.
pretty sure I understand the word wank. Oh,
I think you probably.
I am very versatile in wank.
Indeed. But I had saved up. So on page 7 of Ann Tyler's A Spool of Blue Thread, she uses the term shitwank. And I had never come across this word before, and I thought, I need to save this. This is important to me. And so somewhere in one of the Vernons, I used the word shitwank. And when this went to Jeremy, and Jeremy said, well, I'm not sure. I said, it's Ann fucking Tyler. If Ann Tyler knows what shitwank means, then I'm guessing that the rest of the American people can just catch up,
Wait, but let me put a pin in this for 1 second. So, did Jeremy Davies do the Americanization of Vernon Subutex?
He did, yeah.
All 3?
All 3, yeah. They allowed him to do the 3rd one.
Oh, Jeremy, I'm coming for you, bud. We're gonna talk soon. You're coming on the podcast.
Actually, it was much, much less invasive than I thought it was going to be.
Oh, I'm sure. No, I didn't realize that he was the one that worked on them there. I want him to be on the podcast.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, Jeremy was incredibly light-handed with it. I mean, and again, one of the things so everyone thinks their own version of slang is actual slang, and that everything else is a bit weird.
I have kids.
So I remember, years ago when I first translated Welbeck, and somebody in the States was reviewing it and said, I didn't understand why they got this guy to translate it. It can only really be translated into American English. Because what? Your English is kind of edgier or whatever. It's actually, everyone thinks that their own English is as edgy and as whatever. The odd thing with the English that I'm using, particularly in Vernon, is that British English, although every single British person you will talk to will deny this until they die, is much more porous. If you've got a 15-year-old kid in the UK and they're stopped by what we used to call the cops, they would call them feds. That's just standard British slang these days for cops, even though we do not have an FBI and there's no such thing as feds. But that, and so I had to say to Christopher, this is just what young people say. You're 79, Christopher. It's not your fault, but young people do actually say feds. Sorry.
How do you is it through how do you keep up with slang? I don't know what's on our podcast and what we talked about beforehand, and that's why I'm asking in a weird way.
I spend a lot of time talking to young people, and occasionally you ask them to read stuff. So, for example, I can credit, and this is in Vernon Subutex 1, I can credit the phrase "wake and bake" to a specific child who I am godfather to, who first used the "wake and bake" with me. Now, I understand the concept,
but pause 1 second. So my daughter is 17. My daughter is the perfect reader for your books for anyone within like a 15 to 22 year radius. And she the other day was like, well, we just wake and bake. It's on Wednesdays and we don't have class. And it's like, oh, hey, when your girlfriend just wake and bake in my house? And she's like, yeah. Like that's cool. So send it. Give me my daughter will read for you.
Yeah, no, good, because and wake and bake is a perfect phrase for something. It's not as though I've never done it. It's just that the phrase wake and bake didn't exist at the time. Somebody probably in the London Review of Books, said, why is he using term? Why is he using? So there's a scene again. This is in volume 1 where Vernon meets a girl in a park who he had briefly run into previously in a bar, and they hadn't really spoken. And in the French, she is using terms that he would not understand. They're slang terms, but he doesn't understand them. So I am using terms like on fleek and whatever. And she's saying, well, I mean, this all sounds a bit dated now. Well, actually, so does what she's saying in the French sound dated now. The point is that she needs to be saying something that he, as a 50-something guy, is thinking, what the fuck does this mean? So, I mean, it is bay and on fleek, and, and it was what the average 16-year-old might have been saying then, but nothing dates like slang. I mean, one of the things that we've completely forgotten is, I don't know when either of you last read see, this is what happens when you drink. Catcher in the Rye, but crummy in Catcher in the Rye is spelt with a B rather than two M's. And it doesn't mean, it means seedy in a kind of very sexual way in Salinger. Though actually, these days, if you say something's crummy, I mean, hey, it sounds very dated, but also you just mean it's, crap. It's not very interesting. It's, what you don't mean is it makes you a bit uncomfortable, in a kind of, hashtag something or other way.
That exactly reminds me of like Martin Amis though.
Yeah.
Martin Amis is crummy as that crummy.
It is, yes. But Martin Amis is that kind of crummy. I mean, is one of the reasons that money is, it is one of the reasons that Money is one of the two great defining books of the 1980s in Britain, is that actually he understands language. I mean, there was a wonderful review of a terrible book by Little Martin called Lionel Asbow by the wonderful author Nicola Barker, where she said nobody has told Martin that actually he's a satirist. And he's a great satirist, and he's a funny satirist. But when he tries to write State of the Nation books, it's just boring.
Yeah, no.
I mean, go back to Dead Babies, go back to, the Rachel Papers, go back to Money. I mean, if you have to go back to London Fields, we're fine,
London Fields.
I know, but it was the second best novel that year called, the best novel that year was Michael Moorcock's Mother London, which, where Michael Moorcock finally broke away from years of writing science fiction. But no, and one of the things I love about language, I mean, one of the things that you do with, particularly with slang, is you need to have readers who can read something and say, nobody would say this. And if the person is, supposed to be a 13-year-old now, then I need a 13-year-old now to tell me whether or not this is, something that actually anyone would say.
What I think is problematic with, I agree with your approach. The thing that I'm finding problematic in relation to my own children who are of that age, like my son is 13, turns 14 on Saturday, and his slang changes daily. Yeah. Like there's things that don't stay very long. Like right now, he's just like everyone's just shoddy. Like he's like into one thing from like years ago. And then he changes it to like the next thing 3 or 4 days later. Like the slang isn't as like ground. It has to be grounded in the context of the characters, I think. Also, what do you think of this part of the book? Hello.
But also part of how you use slang is about cadence and rhythm. Part of it is it just fucking sounds nice this way. I mean, any translator will tell you that there are times when you are reading the third draft of your translation and you're reading a sentence and thinking, this sentence needs another syllable in it. I don't know where the other syllable needs to go, but it needs another syllable because it's falling the wrong way. And you do.
I'm pretty sure I read this before, but for your benefit, Brian, a smorgasbord of prime poontang.
Oh, dear.
Yes, the things we don't say anymore, and yet, I was saying to Chad earlier that
one of my favorite lines. I underlined that many times.
I actually got to use the word poontang in a Goncourt winning book, but it was set in Indochina during the Indo-Chinese Wars. Therefore, this is where the term originally comes from. So
I like, even there's like subtleties in the translation. For instance, in one part, a character says "fucktard," and then there's another character that says "fuck wit."
Yeah,
they're kind of around
to get all three of them in there.
Yeah. So I mean, one of the extraordinary things in English is the ability to use the word "fuck" as a noun, an adjective, a verb, a particle, a suffix, a prefix, a whatever.
Like it's in the middle.
Yeah, indeed. So I mean, technically, fucktard and fuckwit are the same thing in that one is half-wit and the other one comes from retard. I'm not really sure, whether anyone's doing gradations here. Again, so much of it has to do with what it sounds like. Exactly. And fucktard is, with all apologies to anybody on any spectrum, whatever, fucktard is a great word for someone you don't like. Correct. Actually, it has nothing to do with their intellectual abilities, their position on the autism spectrum, their whatever. It really is just saying, this is, one of the things that I've always loved about certainly translating French to English. So in English, the word bugger has ceased to have any real meaning at all. The notion that it actually refers to somebody involved in anal sex has long since disappeared. If you call somebody a bugger in English, you might as well call
those husbands are like, yes, sign me up.
Yeah, please. But no, again, no one would even get that reference because they don't actually have that. Whereas there is nothing worse in French that you can call anyone than an enculé, who is the passive person in is an enculé. It's not an enculeur, it's an enculé. So the passive person in anal sex is an enculé, and that is the worst thing that you can call anyone. Whereas actually in English, Winston Churchill memorably in about 1938 or whatever, accidentally knocked someone off their horse on a steeplechase. And the person lying on the ground said, "Winston, you bugger!" And he said, "Having long since left my school days, I am no longer, sir, a bugger." I am no longer, sir, a bugger. It's like, been there, done that, got the t-shirt, but actually, didn't fit. And those are the things. And then you get to, so, one of my favorite, and I will eventually translate it literally at some point. So to nitpick or to, in English, in French is enculer des mouches, which is to arse fuck flies. Which would take quite a lot of delicacy and precision.
Hold on. As someone who's had a lot of experience with knits and picking knits, like, yes, I agree with that entirely. Has Isaac ever had lice, Brian?
No.
Holy shit.
Yeah.
You're so lucky.
Yeah, no, lice are really not fun because, particularly if you're in a relationship, because you just give them to each other for the next, 4 months. It's, it's tedious. Been there, done that, and burned the t-shirt.
So was it a positive experience trying to suss out? Because to me, it felt like there was like this tightrope that you're walking, because there's the age of the people, they're using slang, so it has to be a little bit dated at the same time as being edgy, and having that color to it. Like, it's a really fine line that you're walking in this translation.
It's really tough because, okay, so you have in the first volume, you have 6 narrators. Yeah. They're not really narrators, but actually you're inside their mind, and therefore how they use slang and what sort of words they will use is going to be very, very different. I mean, actually, Vernon isn't all that slangy, but you know, when you get to which one is the racist bastard who
Xavier?
Xavier.
Yeah, Xavier or Xavier. Yes, I did have to explain to Virginie why we couldn't have him working at H&M, even though all the stories are actually true. But I mean,
wait, you're talking about someone else. You're talking about Noel. As the Hitler youth sort of like Nazi person.
And it's like I said, you know, we can't have H&M. And she said, why not? And I said, well, because they will sue. And she said, well, we published it here. I said, no. People sue in England because, you know, the thing with libel in England is you don't have to prove malice. So it is the libel capital of the world. You can accidentally sue somebody. If I wrote a novel, you know, if you or Chad lived in London, and I wrote a novel and I said, you know, Brian and Chad were like at it like rabbits. Even if you could not be identified, but if your friends might have thought, then you can sue me for accidental libel.
Yep.
Whereas both in France and the United States, you have to prove malice. So in the UK, if you sue, the onus is on the defendant to prove that something is true. Now, have H&M abused their staff, used child labor in Asia? I mean, the court cases speak for themselves, but you know, as I said, look, you know, the great problem here is that if you do this, then if they file suit, then there's an embargo on publication, they withdraw, they pulp, and you know, we can make it obvious who they are without actually, you know, mentioning specifically who they are. But no, I mean, shifting tones between characters.
Hold on 1 second. Hold on, Pastor, 1 second. I interpreted H&M as Gap circa 1996 when they had when the Onion would run articles about the Gap where it'd be like Gap orders everyone in the showers. And it was just like an Onion headline. I felt like that and H&M that H&M of the characters in Vernon Subutex are the same enterprise.
Yeah. No, and what's interesting about the various characters is that it's not just that the slang they use is different, but the way that the rhythms of their speech are quite different. The ways in which they think. I mean, both Xavier and Noel. I mean, I know people like Xavier in France who, you know, again, you know, I knew them when in the 1980s when we were friends and we all believed in the same thing, and you know, then they sort of drifted towards voting for the National Front and whatever, and they will all do this kind of, yeah, but you don't understand. And I remember, you know, sitting at dinner with a couple of them and their parents. This is, I don't know, 5 years ago, when they were, you know, ranting on about immigrants, and I said, yeah, but I'm an immigrant. And they said, yeah, but it's not the same. I mean, you're not the same. I said, well, in what way am I not the same? I mean, I am an immigrant. I am not French. I was not born here, but I have come to live here and I'm taking your jobs. And they went, yeah, but you're not black.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I see. Okay, so it is about being black, or brown, or beurre, and you know, I mean, the crucial thing that we need to get onto is what I call displaced slang. So there are lots of slang terms in French that simply don't. It's not even that they don't have an equivalent in English. There is no slang term for this in English. So Vernon is the only version of it that exists in English is called Pig Latin. Nobody over the age of 11 who's not in chess club uses it. Ever.
I tried to use it last week on the podcast.
Okay, but Vernon became crucial within the Arab community and within the extraordinarily broad French hip hop community. And there are people who can speak almost pure Vernon. And it's so the basic principle is the same. You take a word, you split the syllables, and you invert them. So Arab becomes beurre. However, we decided at some point that Arab, first generation Arab, becomes beurre, second generation Arab becomes rebut, third generation Arab. So rebut is actually Vernon of beurre, which in turn is Vernon of Arab. Keuf, which is flic, other way around, take the syllables and invert them. MILF is femme with, but then you can go MILF, femme, femu. So it's endlessly doable. It's an extraordinarily rich language within French, but it has absolutely no equivalent. And so if Virginie is referring to someone as a MILF, then what I need to do is, I can't find another word for woman. Chick is too American, too 1970s. Babe doesn't really cut it. I mean, because actually MILF is not a nice word for a woman. It's not a particularly ugly word, but it's it does not in any sense tell you anything about her other than that she is a woman. So what you need to do is you need to change something in the sentence either earlier or later. So you bring in an adjective or an adverb, or you bring in whatever you need to make it clear that this sentence is being spoken in a very slangy way, but you can't do it by using the word that is itself slang, because there is no version of it. I mean, actually, words for the worst two words in French are to translate are words for either guy, for either woman or man. Because I mean, at least with mec, you can translate it as guy, which is okay. You'll get away with it. There really aren't any good slang terms for women that are not either. The trouble is they're either too specific or too dated or too American or too English or too, you know. So, I mean, if I'd used the word bird, which, you know, 1960s English slang for a girl, you know. I mean, I could have used the word bint, which not only is an old English word slang term for a woman, but actually is direct cognate. It is a lift from Arabic. It means daughter. It was just something that English brought back and used it as a generic term for a young woman without any reference to what it meant. So an awful lot of what you do with slang is shifting. You can't, not every slang word in the original can be slang in the target language, because actually we may not have a slang term for that, or the slang term we have for it may not work because it's, I mean, what the lovely Anthea Bell used to say about translating slang is we try to use non-specific demotic. The trouble is that slang is very specific. And at its best, it's very specific. So it's one of those, it becomes quite flaccid if you start, you know, just using words that everyone in the world probably uses, because those are the ones that have, you know, spent the last 30 years going through, you know, American movies and American sitcoms and British sitcoms and Australian sitcoms and whatever, and everyone basically agrees that guy means a random human being who identifies as male. And it's one of those things where, you know, again, having a great editor or sub-editor, I remember having a sub-editor, a copy editor on a novel I was translating, which is set in the trenches in France with French characters. And the great problem was translating mec. Guy is actually, for British English, it's too early to be using guy, but it's acceptable. And so the copy editor went through and changed it all to chap and fellow. And I said, well, if they were English people fighting in the First World War, then that makes sense. But they're not. They're French people fighting. You know, you can't call them chap and fellow and bloke and whatever. You know, it's like, not only is this very language specific, but they're on the wrong side, you know. I mean,
I'd fancy a croissant.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, absolutely. It's and it's one of those things that, but it is. I mean, what Chad was saying earlier, it's one of the ways in which you can be most creative. You can make things up in slang. You can take an image or an idea and retranslate it. I mean, Julian Barnes in, I don't know, probably History of the World in 10.5 chapters, directly translates the French expression meaning, I suppose it would be, the standard phrase in English would be, he thinks his shit don't stink. But the French is to fart higher than your arse.
Okay.
And once you've translated it, I mean, yeah, okay, the expression didn't already exist, but you kind of know what they mean. You know, it's like, he's the kind of guy who farts higher than his arse. Okay, right. I think we're good. Yeah, this is one of my great problems with Americanization, because my problem with ass is that ass does not have the rather earthy connotation in it that arse does. You know, I mean, it is possible, you know, so I recently for, oh look, I've got a book here. I recently, for a book that I edited, which
yeah. I meant to talk about this at the beginning of the podcast.
Translating Ramon Verlaine, so a sonnet to the arsehole, as far as I'm concerned, has a much more sexual concept to it than a sonnet to the asshole, which is like, well, you know, I mean, we could just be talking about some jerk somewhere, you know, it's not, you know, no, it's there is a great fluidity. I mean, particularly in Englishes, about how you appropriate bits of slang. So, for example, Kiko, particularly the stock trader with the cocaine-fueled parties, speaks almost entirely in a very Americanized slang, because actually, if he was a French stock trader, that's what he would do. If he were a British stock trader, that's what he would do. They aspire to be, you know, Leo during the trying to get into the car scene in Wolf of Wall Street. That's, you know, this is, you know, Valhalla as far as they're concerned. But British slang is that much more porous. I mean, we watch more American movies and more American television series and more American, you know, whatever, than Americans tend to watch of British series. So actually, quite a lot of it has, you know, already exists within British English, and I have no problem using it. You do have occasional problems with editors who say, "Is this really British slang?" It's like, go and sit on a bus. You know, one of the things that I've always said to, you know, people say, you know, about translation, you know, well, what should I do? Sit on a lot of buses and listen to a lot of people. I mean, you need to steal voices from somewhere. You need to listen to what people actually say so that you can create what people actually say.
This is actually the game I was going to play with you earlier is like, what words would you not translate? So like we talked about this in my class of like, you have every word in Vernon Subutex, every offensive possible word.
Yeah.
There. And like, that's, to me, seems very natural and seems to make sense, and it makes sense within the characters. But like, are you as a translator do you ever question that? Do you ever feel like I maybe shouldn't do this?
Yes. But context is everything. I mean, the standard, how many translators does it take to change a light bulb? It depends on the context.
Light bulbs are harder to change in 2021 than they were in 2003. I just want to point that out. So
yeah, the thing is, it's huge. Context is hugely important. There are terms that I will use, and again, and with all apologies to those who don't believe in authorial intent, I have to intuit what I think the author wants this character to sound like. If this character is a racist, then this character will say racist things. That does not mean that I am a racist or that the author is a racist. It only actually means that the character is a racist.
Yep.
Now, if I think that what I have is a lazy author who is using rather casual, misogynistic or racist or whatever terms, then actually I will flag this. I mean, normally what I will do is I will go back to the author and say, actually, I'm not going to use these words in this circumstance because actually I don't think it's necessary, and I think actually it's open to being misinterpreted. You are not attempting to shine a light on a particular mindset or a particular character. You're just actually just using language in a way that I don't think is, I mean, as we said earlier, I mean, the French constant use of fille, meaning any woman who is probably not yet married or, you think might still be available, is something that is not uncommon in French. It is now very uncommon in English, and I would therefore only translate it as girl if either A, it refers to a girl, or B, it is coming from the mouth or from the mindset of somebody who refers to women or to young women in that way, in a dismissive way. But I have no problem with going back to an author and saying, actually, this simply doesn't work. I can't do this in this way in English. In the same way that actually the standard translation these days of pédé in French, which of course comes from pederast rather than even from homosexual, is gay. French has not really particularly changed its slang over time, and in the same way that German has adopted schwul and we have adopted queer, the French have adopted pédé, but you would not actually, I would not translate it as an abusive term unless it seems to me that the intention is that it should be abusive. So yeah, there's quite a lot of that. There are also things that are, so there is the C word. So long ago, in the far mists of time when I translated Welbeck, one of the standard changes in the Americanization was an absolute eradication of the C word.
And by C word, you mean cunt. Like,
I mean cunt, yes.
Yeah. But like when I worked in the bookstore before you translated Welbeck, we sold a book called Cunt.
Yeah, indeed. No, I mean, cunt is actually the oldest English word for the vulva and the vagina. It is one of the least sexist words in that it was not invented by, I mean, the oldest street in London is called Grope Cunt Street. And it was a place where in the 15th century prostitutes hung out. Cunt, cunny, coney, and things related to rabbits generally is relatively common and is not in any sense derogatory. But I live in a country, I come from a country, Ireland, where it is perfectly possible to say about a friend of yours, oh, he's a decent old cunt. And that is not offensive in any way. But in American English, it has become the great word that you do not say. And I completely get that, because actually language is about its culture and about its time and about things that indeed. So I don't have a great problem with that. I mean, but the reason I fought a little bit on Welbeck was that actually frequently when he was using the term, it was intended to be quite as offensive as I thought American readers would take it as. I mean, Welbeck does not particularly deal in subtleties, but you know, he's an equal opportunities offender, and is again, you know, you do neither a reader nor a writer any service by downplaying what it is that you believe they're attempting to say. All of this is an act of interpretation. I realize that. And, you know, the whole idea of, well, I don't want to read translations because it's somebody else's interpretation of a book. Yeah, well, off you go. I mean, learn 460 languages. Off you go, you know. You have no choice, you know. I mean, you could, you know, if you give me a piano and a score of the Goldberg variations, I can play it for you. I learned enough piano to be able to do that. Would you want me to play it for you? No, you fucking wouldn't. I mean, I don't care whether you want Rosalind Shurex played.
No.
No, it's just, this is not what you want, you know. So, yes, one of the things that you try and explain sometimes to editors, it's not just that if somebody else translated this book, it would be different. If I translated it 3 years ago or 4 years from now, it would still be different. Yeah, what I'm reading, what I'm listening to, the songs I'm listening to, the things I've heard, the language that's going through my brain, all of this influences what I'm doing right now, this minute.
So, Frank, aside from pointing out the cunt moment and Kathy Anker's Pussy King and the Pirates, which is being reprinted right now, you're going to be back on here 2 more times.
Yeah, okay.
Everything.
Are you thinking that I should save myself? I mean, you think there's something to save?
No.
We're not here to not it. We're not here to be nitpicking
right now is what song you want us to play as the outro song.
I want you to play Blowjob from Exit and Guyville.